For our first project, you're going to be creating three different collages. The first collage is going to explore the concept of shape, and the second collage is going to explore the concept of value, and the third collage is going to explore the concept of texture. So to do this properly, you really need to have a good understanding of the formal elements of design. So that's what I'm going to focus on in this lecture. The first design element we're going to start with is line. So line defines shape. It also suggests mass and volume. It can be a continuous mark made on a surface with a pointed tool or implied by the edges of shape and form. And the characteristics of line are that it has width, it has length, it has direction, it has focus, and it has feeling. And line makes a big difference in how a design will communicate an emotion or a feeling or a sense. So if you look at these little boxed illustrations here, you see that the upper left is very uniform. It's very conservative, orderly, might be described as static. The upper right here is a little bit less static, but still very evenly spaced, very stable and orderly. And then if you look at middle left, there's sort of an uneven spacing. This might be a little bit more dynamic than the first two boxes, but it's still very orderly and progressive. And then middle right here, you see that it's kind of giving almost the illusion of roundness. It's a little bit more dynamic. There's an orderly progression, but it's sort of giving this sense of dimension. And then in the lower left, varying the line widths and distances, this almost creates a random pattern, which can be described as dynamic, chaotic, or disorderly. And then lower right, you see that the lines are actually changing and they're curving, and there's this sense of movement that's starting to happen. So very dynamic, but it's still a very orderly flow. So line it can be used to describe flat shape. And here you see that line in this graphic is really unifying the design because the entire piece is in the same style. Why are lines so important in graphic design and web design? Because they divide space, they direct the viewer's eyes, they separate content, they direct the flow of content, and they can really be used to create emphasis on a specific area of work. And then if you look just here, this is, note how thick areas of marker to thin show dense areas of type or less. So this is communicating something, even though it's very simple and it's just a variety of lines applied in an orderly way. Some of them are thick, some of them are thin. So a line is also described as a point with no dimensions set in motion, and it can have varying width and length. So a line doesn't have to stay the same, it can change. It can start out very precise, very thin, very orderly, and it can morph into something a lot more gestural. It can even have more texture. And so there are unlimited variations of line. And the one thing that it does is it's a basic element that can convey many different moods and feelings in art and design. It describes shape. It helps recognize familiar objects without displaying actual qualities of the object. And it's really a basic tool that every designer and artist uses. And it's the method that we represent the three-dimensional world. So there's different ways to describe line. Psychic line, which is an invisible line from one element to another. It's where our eye is sort of directed by elements in a design. So a sign pointing, for example, or someone's eyes staring in a certain direction could be a psychic line. There's contour lines, which are lines that are used to make up forms, and they describe the outline of a drawing. There's horizontal lines, the lines that go from left to right, and these convey a feeling of stiffness, stillness, or lack of motion or rest. Horizontal lines are normally associated with sleep because normally a sleeping figure is parallel to the earth. And then there's vertical lines and there's diagonal lines. Why lines are important in graphic design. They also can be used as an organizational guide. Some examples are wireframing in web design, sketching in logo design, properly aligning text and images in web design and graphic design. And there's this whole system that we're going to talk about later in the course called the grid system, which is based on using line as a tool to align your elements in your format. So understanding lines can help you communicate a certain feeling or idea in your work, and it can give you more control over the effect of the work and how your target audience perceives the work. It can help you send out a desired message more effectively, and understanding line can really help you create more effective layouts. You can see here how there's a variety of lines, different colors, different thicknesses. They are sort of going in a direction that's implying speed and motion. So you have outlines, contour lines, gesture lines, sketch lines, calligraphic lines, implied lines. So there's lots of things to think about when we're thinking about that simple element line that at first seems so somewhat insignificant, but as you start to think about it, you see that it is probably the most important element there is, because it's the start of all other elements, except for maybe really diffused color or tonality. And this is a book by Joseph Mueller Brockman that explores the grid system, which we're going to talk about a little bit later in the course. So this is an example of a gestural drawing, a very quick sketch, but you can see that even though it's very simple, it's still capturing a feel. It's capturing a sense of the object, which is a human shape. This is a great example of using line to describe the product. You see that these 0.03 pens create a really, really light line, whereas the 0.07 pens create a really, really thick, dark line. Okay, so you can see how line can also be used to definitely create shape. It can create texture. It can even create value, and definitely can create a sense of depth. And it can also create perspective. So we'll talk about this a little bit more, but the way you create perspective in design is using lines to sort of converge within the space. And this is an example of one-point perspective, where you see the lines kind of going inside of the space, creating this illusion of depth, and they're all going to converge at this one point, which is the eye level or eye point. Just some more examples. Often to sort of express a focal point, lines will get darker or more intense, even more agitated, and that can sort of direct our eye to look inside of the drawing and see a particular area. So line tonality is really important. The darker the line, the more intense the contrast. And you can vary that. So some lines can be really light and thin and delicate, and other lines within a drawing can be really dark and visible. This was a series of posters and designed for San Francisco performances that announced upcoming performances. And they were put up all over bus shelters and various places in the city. And you can see how line is really a primary element in the design. And this is just using an image as reference. This is something that designers frequently do, where they'll take an image and they'll sketch it out and redraw it or re-envision it. You can see using a photograph for reference to create a line here. And line is also called a closed path in design, where when you start designing in Illustrator, you're going to create these lines called paths. And some paths are open, which is just sort of a line itself, and other paths are closed, which is a line that creates a shape. So you can see that the shape and volume of the tree are accentuated by the curved lines which follow the tree around, sort of really intensifying that sense of depth. It's also creating texture. So there's all these different elements of design to consider besides line. We have shape, we have value, we have color, we have texture, we have format. And you really want to think about shape and value because you're going to be exploring them in your collage. So shape is the general outline of something. And design is basically, if you just think about it in a really simple sense, is the arrangement of shapes, including shapes between shapes or spaces between shapes and shapes created by overlap. And there are many different types of shapes. There's representational shapes, there's non-representational shapes. This is an example of a non-representational shape where it doesn't, it's not trying to recreate something in the natural world. And this is a representational shape where the shapes are referencing something. So designers use both types of shapes frequently. There's also geometric shapes, and these can usually be described using mathematical terms, and they are very regular or precise, and they're not often found in man-made things because they are easier to reproduce and make things with. And an example of a geometric shape would be squares, rectangles, triangles, circles, ovals, pentagons, and so on. And these are more free-form or organic shapes, and these are difficult to describe because they're irregular or uneven, but they are often found in nature, and you often don't find really geometric shapes in nature. You find these more organic, free-form shapes. And examples of that would be clouds or puddles or trees or leaves, rocks, so on. And here's an example of a closed path in Illustrator where you're creating shapes with line and you're coming back to the initial starting point. When you get to the end point, the starting point and the end point connect. And that's a closed shape in Illustrator or a closed path. So shape can be described as the general outline of something, and different ways to create shape is with lines. They can be open, filled, or closed paths. An area of color or an area of gray can also describe shape. And in most forms of art, shapes may be considered positive or negative, depending on how they are used. So positive shapes are usually those where the subject matter within the work is in the foreground, and negative shapes are the shapes that are being created outside of the positive shapes, and it would be the shapes where there isn't any content. And this is a great example of a design with equal negative and positive space where we're kind of losing track. What's the positive? What's the negative here? Another example of that. So a composition is the organization and placement of these shapes on your picture plane. And it's using positive and negative to really create the space. Sometimes shapes overlap, sometimes there's size variation, sometimes there's color added or value. This was a great ad campaign by Avia, and it really reflects the emotion and passion and intensity of sports participation. And the beauty of it was you can't see the models' faces, and it lets you sort of project yourself into the ad. You could see yourself being that athlete. If you were to get in the best shape of your life and use their products, you might become this. And so it was kind of brilliantly done. And it's really beautiful how they put the positive shapes, the bodies of the athletes, inside the frame. And they also created this really beautiful sense of the negative space. Martus Cornelis Escher was one of the world's most famous graphic artists, and he's really well known for his impossible constructions that he created. And he was a Dutch graphic artist, and he created these mathematically inspired woodcuts, lithographs, and mezzotints. And they really are these amazing explorations of infinity. And during his lifetime, he made over 448 lithographs, woodcuts, and wood engravings, and 2,000 drawings and sketches. And there's just some of them. And you can see how there are so many intricate, detailed shapes. And it's really kind of interesting the way that he's exploring perspective through the positioning and the overlapping of the shapes, the size variations. Another way to create shape other than an outline is using an area of color that is not surrounded by line. So some shapes are stroked by line, others are just flat color. But color is really powerful and provocative. And color can be divided into three distinct principles. There's hue, which is the name of the color, value, which is the range of light to dark, and then there's saturation, which is the brightness or dullness of a color. We are going to have a whole color lecture next week, so I'm not going to talk too much today, but just understand that color is probably one of the most powerful things that you can add to design to really control the emotion of the design, and also to direct your focal point and area of emphasis. Value is basically the relative lightness or darkness of a certain area. So don't confuse value with color. Value can include color, but really value is that variation from pure white to pure black. And it's used in the language of art to refer to the value of light. The more light, the higher the value. White is the highest or lightest value. And on the other hand, black is the lowest or darkest value. And colors have value as well. Yellow, for example, has a relatively high light value, while violet has a relatively low value dark. So there's lots of ways to express value, and this is going to be one of your challenges with your projects this week. And it's very important to drawing and painting because value changes the contrast, and contrast is needed to help us see and understand a two-dimensional work of art. For example, if there was no value or contrast between the words on this page and the background, you would have difficulty reading what is there. But because they've intensified the value or lightened up the text, it's actually what we're kind of drawn to. And this is an example of sort of darker value ranges or a low value print. There's not a lot of contrast in here. So you have both high contrast and sort of a lower contrast image base that you can work with. And contrast is the difference between the lightest and darkest values in an image. High contrast images have a large range of values from the darkest shadow to the lightest highlight. And low contrast images have more narrow range of values, resulting in a flatter look. And value is really created by a light source that shines on an object and creates highlights and shadows. It also illuminates the local or actual color of the subject, and it creates depth within a picture, making an object look three-dimensional. So when you start to analyze imagery, look for those highlights and cast shadows, and you'll start to see the different value range in the image. So value scales are charts that demonstrate the changing values of a tone, and a typical value scale has incremental steps running from dark to light or vice versa. And a scale may also be continuous gradient of tones where the change is blended and tonal steps are not visible. And here's two examples, one of a gradient and one of a chart. And you can see value all the time in design. And there's when we start studying the design history, you'll see that there's very high contrast in the Russian constructivism posters we're going to look at. And in design, we describe tints as adding white to a color to create lighter values, such as light blue or pink. And a shade is adding black to a pink color to create dark values, such as dark blue or dark red. And high key is a picture with all light values, and low key is a picture with all lower values. So texture. Texture is the next design element we're going to look at. And texture refers to the surface quality in a work. We associate textures with the way that things look or feel, and everything has some type of texture. We describe things as being rough, smooth, silky, shiny, fuzzy, and so on. And some things feel just as they appear. This is called real or actual texture. And some things look like they are rough but are actually smooth. And texture that is created to look like something it is not is called visual or implied texture. And this is another sculpture by Merit Oppenheim. And you can just see that fur. I want to reach out and touch it and stroke it. It's, a very visual sensation that kind of almost makes us feel that sensation of touch. Patterns can have texture. So this is an example. If you create a repeating pattern and you just take a small element or a small shape and repeat it over and over and over again, it's going to create a sense of texture, which is a good way to work in design sometimes. Patterns are often used in design to give this sense of texture. Type can be a form of texture. This is an example of type overlaid on top of type, and it creates this real kind of cool textural effect that could be used in different ways in a design. And texture, it represents the surface quality, and visual textures are created by designers to give the illusion of the tactile quality. And texture may be used in a work of art to create visual interest or focal point, to create contrast, or to help visually balance a design or composition. And just in the natural world, there's texture everywhere. So look around and you can see it. And then you could take, for example, photos of things like tree bark or grass or dirt, and then you can use those textures in your designs or recreate them in illustrations. So visual or implied texture can be simulated or invented, and simulated texture is the type that is created to look like something it is not. For example, in a drawing or painting of a cat where its fur is made to look like real fur. Invented texture, on the other hand, may look rough or smooth or any other feeling, but it's purely made up by the artist. It doesn't look like real texture. And here's a great album cover by Lou Reed where this text is becoming sort of a texture effect. So we've explored these elements, and now you're also going to think about the constraints of the frame. So in your collage, you're going to be given a certain dimension, and then you're going to cut that out with black paper or with white paper, and then you're going to paste things onto it to create the sense of the element that you're describing. So one of your elements will be shape, and the other element will be value, and the third element will be texture. But you know that as you create your composition, you're also sort of creating a design where the elements interact. And so start to think about that, because next week we're going to be thinking about design principles, which is all about how the placement of elements affects the composition. For example, larger objects appear closer, smaller objects further away. So as you sort of do your design this week, think about how the feeling or the mood or the perspective or the depth changes as you lay the elements onto the page. So if you overlap elements, it's going to make the front element appear closer. And placement where a shape or object is in relationship to the horizon line creates a sense of depth. So things closer to the horizon line can appear further away, and objects closer to the bottom or top of your paper appear closer. There's atmospheric perspective, where objects recede into the distance, begin to lose color, brightness, and detail. And then there's shading, adding light and shadow to the surface of an object to mimic the way real objects would appear under the same lighting. And there's linear perspective, which we talked a bit about. It's the system of drawing that was developed during the Renaissance period, and it's where you create lines that converge on vanishing points to achieve a more realistic illusion of space. And linear perspective is described by the number of vanishing points used, 1 point, 2 point, or 3 points. And so as you look at designs this week and think about designs, I want you to look for these elements, look for the shapes, look for the texture, look for the value, look for the color, and think about how the designer applied them and why the designer applied them in specific ways. So for example, in this design, you see that color is being used really strategically to balance the design. You have some color kind of on the lower left going towards the middle, and then you have little spots of color up in the letter shapes to create this sense of balance and unity. This text paragraph over here is literal words that you can read so that you can get information, but it's also creating sort of a texture effect. That's kind of interesting. And then you have shape. So this black frame here is a specific shape, and then this white is a specific shape. And there's sort of a positive negative thing happening here with the black and white. So start to analyze these designs and look for these elements. It'll be really helpful going forward to always think about these elements because you're going to be using them so strategically as a designer. So how do you create that sense of texture in design? How do you create a sense of positive and negative? What type of lines are you creating to convey an emotion in the design or communicate something within the space? And so as you do your collages, I'm just going to show you some examples. This is an example of a texture collage created by a student. So you can see that it's also communicating other things. There's some color here, there's some shape here, there's some line here. But as you do this project, I want you to think about the primary element you're focusing on, whether it be texture, shape, or value. And that's what you want to focus on and communicate. So if I looked at this and I said, this, or if I showed this to you and I said, this is about texture, there would be a moment where you said, oh, I get it. I see the texture. I'm experiencing the texture. And sometimes there's a little bit of ambiguity in these collages because you're adding other elements as well. It might be communicating shape and line and value, but the primary element is the one that you want to really focus on and think about as you create the collage. You also want to create, think of the space as a whole. So you want to probably think about the whole shape, and you want to fill the space. If you do have some negative areas in the design, you want those negative areas to be interesting to look at. You don't want it to just be a center element that you put in with lots of space. It kind of looks like it's floating in space. That's not good. You want it to really fill the space and create a sense of the space. This is an example of texture, by the way, and this was also an example of texture done by a student. And this is another one. So giving you some ideas. And the way students have done it in the past is they just take a big sheet of paper. It can be 8.5 by 11, or you can cut it to be an 8 by 8 frame if you want. And then you start to glue down the elements. If you're really good with Photoshop and you want to jump to a design software, you can also do that. Another example of texture. And this is just using newspaper print to create that sense of texture using the type elements. Another one, communicating texture. And last, this one's the last one. So you can also see I'm kind of moving into an area where this one, the student talked about this design as also being about value. So the primary element was texture, but there was a sense of value that the student also wanted to communicate. This one was about value, where you're going from sort of a light range to a dark range. So think about in your value collage, you can use a color or you can use simple black, gray, white, but you want to communicate that sense of something getting lighter or darker. And if you add in other elements like texture, shape, color, just make sure that the primary element, value, is definitely the element being communicated, like it is in this one. And it's being communicated beautifully here as well. This was a little bit more conceptual. The student was trying to communicate value. It also communicates shape. It's just an interesting concept, though, all the different ears and all the different photographs. The grid is pretty compelling in design. It makes us want to look and analyze. And this is a beautiful design about shape where they're just using simple positive and negative, and there's sort of a space ambiguity happening. Another one about shape. So you can use, for your shape collage, you can just use simple like black and white paper if you want. Really simple, easy. And if you want to do shapes that are about something in the literal world, like the spider, go for it. But if you want to do just pure abstract shapes, that's fine as well. This is an example of sort of abstract shapes communicating that concept beautifully. And then I'm just going into some that are more, these are a little bit more ambiguous. This one was shape, but I also see texture. I see color. This was shape, but I also see color. So maybe in the note, as you sort of upload your collages, write a note about each one, label each one, and identify it. What are you trying to communicate? Is it shape, texture, value? And you have to do 3, and you have to communicate all 3 principles. And so just label them so people really understand which design is value, which design is texture, and which design is shape. And I threw this in here because this is an example of bad design. So it's definitely communicating color, which was the intent of the designer. But you notice that there's a lot of white space. There's not really much going on except for the value scale. It's kind of sloppy. So as you do this project, I really want you to think about the whole as well as the element you're communicating. And then it's kind of a good idea to think about focus too. Where do you want the viewer to look? And don't do something where you have this feeling where it's just floating in space or you don't address large portions of the frame. This is another example of one that wasn't very successful. It's kind of clever. The student was using, real objects, but all they really did was lay them out and take a picture. And I don't really see this interaction occurring that would make it sort of a cool collage. They're very cool elements, and I think the idea of shape is being communicated, but they're all sort of equally distanced in terms of the spacing. There's not a lot of thought to the negative. They're just sort of laying there. There is sort of a sense of scale, but it's not really functioning that well. So think about how can you make it interact and make it interesting to look at. Okay, so have fun with this project. You can do hand collage techniques if you're not good with the software, and you can use Photoshop or some other design software. That's up to you. And if you need some help, we're going to have Open Lab, and Sarah Pat will be in the Open Lab, and she's really knowledgeable about Illustrator and Photoshop, so she can help you out. And those are going to be posted on the course homepage. And make sure that you watch the other videos and that you do the reading this week. There's a good handout on the design elements that you should look at. It kind of describes all the design elements, including shape, value, texture, line, and it'll give you a good sense of it, especially if you haven't really thought about these elements before. So just let me know if you have any questions.